Good morning, U.S. history. How are we? I hope everything finds you well. And today finds you well and your family well. Um, I guess you saw me playing with a little background thing there. Um, in case you're curious about that, and um, for other classes, little tutorial on Zoom for a moment. If you're using your cell phone, there should be a little choice of more options with three dots thing. You click on that, it'll show choose virtual background. Um, for those of you using computer, at the bottom of your screen where it says stop video, there's a little arrow to the right of that. You can click on it and it has you choose your virtual background so that you can actually wind up looking like this. Hang on. Boom. Now, how annoying would that be for me to give that lecture with this as the background? So I'm going to go ahead and click that off. Okay, so I was giving just a moment for people who are having internet difficulties to log on. We should be squared away. By this point, you have probably heard the news or seen a report on some form of social media, something anyway that has exposed you to the knowledge of, hey, you don't have to go back to the classroom this year. It hit a little bit more heavy than many of us were anticipating. We pretty much all knew that it was going to happen. You and I both knew that. Because I mean, really and truly, we're not at a place where we could probably return to a classroom just yet. But the announcement when it made it final, when it made it official, it's quite a heavy announcement. It weighed heavy on me anyway, and I think it did others as well. But now we know. Now we know, and we know that we're in our online format, and it's going to work out fine. We're going to move forward. Now we know how to plan, right? So we will be finishing up our discussion on civil rights around the turn of the century through the end of the progressive era. And once we finish that topic, we will transition into preparing for our progressive era test, and we'll see where that lands us for the year. And then we'll do some document-based questions, etc. So we're good. We have been busy. Both of us, you and I, have been really busy this year. I say both as though all of you are one, right? Anyway, you guys have worked really, 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 really hard this year, and we have a collection of artifacts available that we can create a file for you. So I think we're going to be good on that. We're not in panic mode in our class. You have done a lot of work already, and we've covered most of the curriculum already. So we're good. We just need to finish this out, and we can move forward. As a reminder, I do upload these. I do upload these videos of the class to the Corinth High School Social Studies channel, YouTube channel, should I say. And so they are available there for viewing and for taking notes. Some of these slides I'll be moving through rather rapidly. You do, at some point, we're going to have to figure out how to show that you took virtual, that you actually took notes, and we're going to have to figure out a way for you to reveal your portfolio to me. That is not today. We also are going to have to figure out how to actually do a test. And I'm really thinking the whole sit down timed with cameras on is the angle that we're going to use for this. Now, there should be no questions in relation to an essay, as you had one due on Monday, and I've yet to officially assign the success or not of the progressive era essay, the B-level essay for that, the large one. So let's go ahead and finish our topic. Does anyone have any questions about what we've already discussed in relation to civil rights around the turn of the century? Does anybody need me to further explain something, to revisit anything? Am I losing you? I really probably need to make sure that I wanted to make this as comfortable for you as possible. So the cameras are off. Okay, so obviously I'm freezing up for some people. I know that AT&T is having some problems in Corinth, and it may be related to that. I don't know. But to repeat what I said, the notes, you are going to have written notes and have those notes transcribed as well. I know that the way we're going through this material does not facilitate you taking a lot of notes, and in some cases, any off of a slide. So you will have to revisit these videos on the social studies channel on YouTube, Corinth High School Social Studies channel, to actually pause and take the notes, or you can screenshot the slides to actually take notes from them. We're going to have to transition for the rest of the year. It's not today, so don't panic. But starting on Monday, officially on Monday, we're going to bring everyone's camera live. All right. We're facing a situation where a lot of people are, they log on, they have their name active, and they're not really invested. They're walking away from the computer, etc. So starting Monday, we're going to need you to have your camera on if it's at all possible, if you have the bandwidth, etc. If there's a technological issue with that, you need to message me in private so that I can be aware of that. So be prepared. Be prepared to actually have your face on screen. Got it? Everybody understand? We good? We good? So let's begin the lecture, shall we? When last we left, we were talking about the attempt of that second generation post-Civil War to extract a little bit of the power back, to try to reinstitute, specifically the white Southern population, trying to reinstitute old social and political order. And the system that was devised was one that became known as Jim Crow. And we discussed Mississippi actually changing its constitution to reflect that. So here's what the Mississippi solution was, all right, in a nutshell. It made literacy and comprehension tests a requirement for registering to vote, poll taxes, strict registration deadlines, grandfather clause, property qualifications, good character requirements, white primaries, and it was very effective. So let's get into some of those for a moment. Literacy and comprehension test, the way that cut down on Southern Black registration, it wasn't just literacy tests, okay? There would be separate ways that the literacy test would be given to someone who is registering to vote based on their race, and where you had simplistic literacy exams the wrong question, but literacy tests for oftentimes for white citizens who would come in to register to vote. When African American citizens would come in, there would be comprehension related tests, and oftentimes it would be very complicated legalese style of passages, sometimes biblical passages that were rather complicated. So it was more than a literacy exam. And you can pretty much just discount anyone's explanation if you desire, because it's kind of a subjective comprehension is kind of a subjective thing on the ear of the beholder, right? So it was very hard to get past that particular hurdle for African Americans. Poll taxes, you know why that was effective? Because most African Americans in the South had remained tied to land via sharecropping, and sharecropping wasn't a cash based job. It was you were tied to the land. You charged most everything that you used throughout the year, and so you didn't get paid cash. So coming up, even though $1 poll tax, it may not sound like a lot to you guys. Of course, it's a different dollar than exists today, but nevertheless, it's quite an ordeal when you don't get paid cash to come up with cash to be able to vote. Strict registration deadlines, arbitrary registration deadlines, grandfather clause, meaning if you're literally Grandfather Claus, which would be a great name for the final Santa Claus movie, wouldn't it? Grandfather Claus. Anyway, I digress. Grandfather Clause is a common legal term today, meaning it excludes one party from requirements that are being included in a contract because they were under a prior agreement. When we say grandfather clause in this context, it literally means grandfather. In other words, if your grandfather voted, you could vote. Now, you're already probably, if you're invested in this discussion right now, you're probably already logically understanding how that would eliminate African Americans and include white Southerners, right? Because black Southerners, all the grandfathers had been slaves, and white Southerners, you know, obviously their grandfathers could vote. Oftentimes, property requirements. Again, the shareholder. Good grief, the sharecroppers didn't own the property. They would hold, now this is bizarre, oftentimes primaries would be held where primaries were available. Oftentimes primary would be held in facilities that were white only. Now, that's just blatant. Did it work? Yes, it was very effective. Black voting rate dropped. In Mississippi, on the eve, now keep in mind that in Mississippi in the 1870s and at some elections in early 1880s, black participation had been over 75%. Now let that sink in. That's higher than today. But when we get to 1890, right before the Constitution was adopted, the black voting rate in Mississippi was around 50%, still relatively solid. And after the Mississippi solution was put into place, the voting rate dropped to 5%. Now that is an effective policy. And so once the Supreme Court okayed it, other Southern states followed suit and did the same thing. Also, how often do you hear the term 9/11 now? Like in just conversation, referencing it with hushed tones or respectful conversation, or trying to remember. How many times do you see major 9/11 memorial style presentations in September? It comes around, doesn't it? It's still around. People still remember it, but it's very rare. You probably remember it being much more prevalent when you were in early elementary school, if you can remember that. And here we are now, about 19 years removed, right? 20 years removed. So think about Reconstruction for a moment and what's going to be done in the South. What's going to be done with the black population in the South? What's going to be done with schools in the South? How will the South be rebuilt? This trauma that the South had faced and was being dealt with by the legislative body, by the time we get to the 1890s, is a little bit old news. People are sick of hearing about it. Remember that Reconstruction ended in 1877. By the time we get to the 1890s, that's about the amount of time from now to 9/11, right? So people it's out of their systems. As a matter of fact, there's almost sort of a backlash to things that had been put into place during Reconstruction, some protective statutes. By 1894, most Reconstruction statutes had been reversed, okay? And you can see here now, I think, let every trace of Reconstruction measures be wiped from statute books, was said on the floor of Congress in a debate. In Williams versus Mississippi, the federal Constitution was interpreted by the Supreme Court to, and this is a quote, allow states to take advantage of the, quote, alleged characteristics of the Negro race. Reconstruction was a thing of the past, man. The Freedmen Bureau was long gone by this point. By this point, this old social order, this old political order was being reinstituted by a brand new generation. So was it successful? Was Jim Crow successful? Well, now, if you were answering a Cambridge question, if you were answering a B-level essay question, you would first have to define the word successful, wouldn't you? What does it mean to be successful? But let's take a look. Hold on a moment. Here we go. Disenfranchisement by constitutional amendment happened in these former Confederate states plus Oklahoma, where literally the constitution of these states, guys, now you need to understand that. The constitution of these states was changed for the specific purpose of disenfranchising an entire race of people. Now, in Texas, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Florida, the Constitution itself wasn't changed, but laws were passed, both at the state level and in individual townships and counties, et cetera. But basically, disenfranchisement happened by poll tax and state law. So, as you can see, across the South, disenfranchisement of African Americans became a matter of law. Now, above the Mason-Dixon line, up here in the North, it wasn't a utopia for Black Americans, right? There was still discrimination. There was still even segregation. But in the South, the difference, and the reason that we study this in history, the difference for the South is it was legalized. It was codified, okay? Meaning punishment for breaking these rules, legal punishment. Let's take a look at just Louisiana for a moment. In 1896, there were 130,000 African Americans registered to vote in Louisiana. Now let that sink in for a moment. 130,000. By the time we get to 1904, 8 short years later, because remember, the rolls were purged prior to these solutions being put into place, and there was a lot of re-registration that had to take place. By the time we get to 1904, only 1,300 were registered to vote. That's over a 90% decrease in people who can vote. That's quite significant. So it was an effective plan that those in power in the South used. Between 1900 and 1914, the backlash to Jim Crow was rather significant in the African American community. Obviously, as you can imagine, having rights taken away from you is not a fun thing. I'm not going to get into the debate that you may see raging right now on social media in relation to our own modern day rights, nor am I going to try to compare that to this era of time. Nothing to compare, not trying to say that you should. But yes, there was resistance. So between 1900 and 1914, over 1,100, and this is recorded lynchings. Over 1,100 African Americans were lynched. Now, that is the social weapon that was used to institute this legalized form of segregation that turned into Jim Crow. And guys, in the middle of all of this is, as a backdrop now, you understand what happens with the events of Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, who can remind the class on what Plessy versus Ferguson was? Who's got that information stuck up here in the old noggin? Now, if you're paying attention, somebody may be doing this right now. But who can, in their own words, describe what Plessy versus Ferguson was? Obviously a court case, right? I need to be able to add graphics, and this is where a tumbleweed would blow across the screen. No one?
Where Plessy was like on a rail car or whatever that was purely for colored people, and he argued that wasn't constitutional, but the Supreme Court ruled that public services are allowed to be separated as long as treatment is the same, like the conditions are the same.
That is primarily what Plessy versus Ferguson did.
By 1877, Reconstruction had succumbed to bitter opposition and backroom politics. Federal troops then occupying the South were withdrawn, and white supremacists were left to reestablish the racial hierarchy that had existed before the war. Across the former Confederacy, informal practices of racial discrimination were written into law. States instituted poll taxes, literacy tests, and other requirements that disenfranchised Negroes. They passed Jim Crow laws, which imposed segregation and other restrictions on blacks. A few blacks challenged the system of legal discrimination. In New Orleans, a man named Homer Plessy deliberately defied the Louisiana state law requiring separate rail cars for blacks and whites. He was arrested and jailed. But the incident led eventually to the Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy argued that the law infringed on his 14th Amendment right to equal protection. But the majority of justices disagreed. The court's opinion read in part:
legislation is powerless to eradicate racial instincts or to abolish distinctions based upon physical differences. If one race be inferior to the other socially, the Constitution of the United States cannot put them upon the same plane.
The court affirmed that segregation was constitutional as long as accommodations were separate but equal. It also left it up to the individual states, not the federal government, to guarantee equal standards. As the lone dissenting opinion, Justice John Marshall Harlan wrote,
the thin disguise of equal accommodations will not mislead anyone, nor atone for the wrong this day done.
Plessy versus Ferguson became a landmark decision. It sanctioned a system of institutionalized racism that would persist for decades, one that would require a second period of Reconstruction. By 1877, Reconstruction.
So Plessy versus Ferguson, that's kind of it in a nutshell. But so that you can understand it in more detail. Essentially, those who would oppose state laws that made it necessary for businesses to provide separate facilities for both white customers and black customers throughout the South. As you can imagine, some of these larger businesses, which were purely driven by profit, that crossed state lines and operated in multiple sections of the country, whether it be energy companies or resource-based companies or transportation companies like railroads, were very, very, very resistant to this because that was going to be very expensive to do. So secretly, this whole effort was funded by, for the large part, railroad companies. They wanted to actually challenge this law. They set it up in such a way that they got a judge who would have been friendly to the cause. Because Plessy versus Ferguson does not say Plessy versus Louisiana, does it? There's a name in there, Ferguson. And that's the actual judge that's in the original case. So let's follow this through. The Separate Car Act in Louisiana separate the races. So you're probably aware it was just one more of the Jim Crow laws from this era of time. And they chose the exact right person. Now you saw even in that video there, which was well done and part of a larger segment that was clipped for this class here to use for educational purposes. Anyway, out of that documentary, it shows the political cartoon that I showed on another slide that supposedly shows Homer Plessy being removed from the railroad car. That's actually a trolley car, and it's in Philadelphia, and it's in the 1830s, if I'm remembering properly. It had nothing to do with this case. Homer Plessy was, for all intents and purposes, a white Southerner, okay? He was, matter of fact, There are really no extant photographs of Homer Plessy. There may be one that some researchers, and I may have this wrong. I don't have the information in front of me, but I think it's out of Illinois that the research is being done, but I could be mistaken. But that's what my old man in my brain is telling me that are doing on the issue. And they may have found an old photograph of an older guy leaned against a column outside of a graveyard in New Orleans. Anyway, but there's no for real validated photograph of Homer Plessy. For all intents and purposes, we really don't know what he looked like. History just tells us that this guy was white. Okay, he looked white, and so they chose him specifically because he wouldn't have any problem buying a ticket. He wouldn't have any problem getting on the white car, etc. So that's what happened. That's what went down. And when the conductor comes through to get his ticket, he says, "Hey, by the way, and then that starts it. He actually tells the conductor. And so he says, "Well, you're going to have to move to the," and then he does it, and that sets the whole thing up. Now, the penalty for sitting in the wrong car was 20 days in jail or a $25 fine. He was arrested. He spent one night in jail, and then he was released the next morning on bond. Plessy, and the case was, again, specifically picked to go in front of Judge John Howard Ferguson. And they handpicked this particular judge because he had previously already declared that train cars traveling in more than one state didn't have to operate under the Separate Car Act. So this appeared to be a judge that was friendly to their cause, so to speak. Now, to remind you of what the 13th Amendment was, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except for this punishment of crime, 14th Amendment, the Equal Rights Amendment, of course. 15th Amendment is not on here. That's dealing with the right to vote. The court actually rules in favor of the state. So the state had the power to segregate. So he obviously brings suit against the judge. That's the case that makes its way. Once it gets into federal court, it's named after the judge, should I say. And it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And in 1896, the Supreme Court of the United States of America ruled against him and created this principle that became known as separate but equal. Separate but equal. And we all know now, retroactively looking back at it, that separate is inherently unequal because there is an undertone of inferiority that that exists. Okay. The language used is rather shocking to the 21st century student because, man, that was 120 some odd years ago, and boy, does it show. The ruling was 8-1. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled 8-1 in creating this. So Plessy versus Ferguson actually was the federal government putting its stamp, boom, of approval on Southern segregation. Jim Crow, we say, was born out of Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, not a problem, Grace. It's been doing that today. There's some internet issues in Corinth. Remember that this video will be available for you later today on YouTube to return to. Take a look. Only one guy actually dissented. One guy. The majority opinion was written by Justice Henry Brown. He said that it did not conflict with the 13th Amendment. And he went on to say that the 13th Amendment was not a statute which would change the distinction between the races. Yeah. And that the object of the 14th Amendment was undoubtedly to enforce the absolute equality of the two races before the law, But in the nature of things, it could not have been intended to abolish distinctions based on color or to enforce social equality as distinguished from political equality or a commingling of the two races upon terms unsatisfactory to either. Supreme Court of the United States. Wow. So Plessy versus Ferguson gave birth to Jim Crow, although in a much more real sense, the Mississippi solution had already begun that process and would be tested later with Williams versus Mississippi. The dissenting opinion. One Supreme Court justice wrote, "Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. In respect to civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law." And then he goes on to say, "In my opinion, the judgment this day rendered will in time prove to be quite as pernicious as the decision made by this tribunal in the Dred Scott case." He was proven right, historically speaking. And he goes on to say that it's going to create conditions which will create brutal conditions for brutal and irritating conditions for African Americans, and that this decision defeats the beneficent purpose which the people of the United States had in view when they adopted the recent amendments of the Constitution. He recognized it. Now, you want to know a little bit of weirdness here, how bizarre sometimes that history can be. John Harlan. Anybody know that name? Heard that name in history at all? Maybe not. Former slave owner, former plantation owner. How about that? Former Southern plantation owner. And he's the only voice that actually spoke out against it. So once Plessy versus Ferguson was passed, Jim Crow was solidified. And separate but equal became a term that permeated society. It is very difficult for us to understand this as a background, okay? But remember, progressive era, 1896, going into the 20th century. So as we were discussing in earlier classes about reforms made in inner city, about better conditions in inner city and improving working conditions, and some states extending unemployment benefits initially, and discussions about health insurance for the first time, and better sewage, more police protection, better fire protection, as we make this conversion to electric power in inner city, as the progressive era is extending the right to vote to women, and as muckrakers are exposing problems with monopolies and trust, and exposing issues in the meatpacking industry and in energy and everything else. This was the background socially. This was being established in the early progressive era. So why do I cover civil rights at the turn of the century in connection to the progressive era? Well, I'll let you address that in your essay. Is that fair? No social interactions allowed, especially no intermarriage. So, separate but equal. Was it? Well, it was definitely separate, wasn't it? Was it equal? You tell me. Now, those of you who have helped your family in the past do some plumbing, I want you to look at this picture for a moment. Who can explain to the class what is happening in this picture? Surely somebody has a plumber in their family.
I'm not that great, but is the colored water?
Okay, I'm losing you. You're breaking in and out. But I do want you to try again.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I can hear you very clearly now. Thanks, Kate Rivers.
Okay,
Yeah,
I was
right.
saying, is the colored water fountain getting the backwash from the white water fountain? I'm
Look at
not
that.
that good at
Yeah,
swimming.
yeah, you're absolutely right. You can see that so long as no one is drinking from the white water fountain, then the segregated water fountain. Number one, just look at the two. Okay, where is the refrigeration unit and the white water fountain? Right, which has the newest I don't know what nozzle, is that the right term for this, which has the newest, obviously the newest water fountain, the white water fountain. So which one has the refrigerated water? The white water fountain. What would happen is you can see that so long as no one was drinking from the white water fountain, then clean refrigerated water would flow into the separate fountain. But if there happened to be someone white drinking, you can see this line right here. See that? Then whoever's drinking here would be drinking the backwash from the white fountain. Separate but equal. I don't really want to go into that. By the start of the 20th century, African Americans faced economic discrimination, legalized codified social segregation, an increase in violence, and a loss of political voice. So I'm going to pause here. I don't want to overwhelm you with information. So we're going to pick up with the 1900 slide on Monday. Okay. As usual, I will make myself available to you on Friday to answer any questions that you may have, to further explain anything, to make any resource available to you, to review anything to do with your grades. Remember, I am offering you the opportunity to rehabilitate your past grades. Please take advantage of that. This is a very unique situation. I am aware that this is a very unique situation. And I'm trying everything that I can to extend the courtesy to you to be able to rehabilitate your grades, since you're not having a traditional 9 weeks to do so. I really want you to take advantage of that. I want you to move that grade needle significantly, okay? So when you get items turned in on Canvas, please message me and let me know that you actually got those submitted so that I can get those put into your prior 9 weeks grades and get that posted so that it can impact your grades and GPA. Okay. What I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to end the recording. And when I end the recording and say bye-bye to you guys, if you have a question that you would like answered, please hang around. And I will be absolutely happy to answer that for you. But for the rest of you guys, please be safe, be safe, be safe. Use your brain. And I love you and I'm praying for you. And I wish the best for you and your family. I'll see you, most of you, literally means see you, by the way. Don't forget, cameras will be live on Monday. Be prepared to have your camera live on Monday. Everybody got that? Okay. So I'll be here Friday to answer questions. So I'll post that announcement for you on Canvas and give you the information to log in, so that if you have questions, I'll just be sitting here reading the news, probably waiting on a student to ask a question or not. Otherwise, I'm about to stop the recording. I wish you a very happy day and have a great evening, guys.